Hey everyone, welcome back to Dissatisfied Philosophy. Today I'm going to be responding to Gavin Ortlund's recent video on universalism. I learned about this video about 2 days before he posted it. He posted on Twitter like, here are the next 10 videos I'm going to do, and I saw the first one was he wants to make a video responding to universalism. So Gavin, if you're familiar with him, he is a Baptist pastor, and he's also one of, I think, the most academic channels for Protestant theology currently on YouTube. And so him making a video about this is, I think the onus is on for Universalists to respond. And so I don't know if I'm the first, but I may very well be. So I'll take a crack at it. So I took notes for this because I do want to kind of hit on most of these points, because I think that while I don't blame Gavin himself for making most of these mistakes, I think that a lot of it is due to ignorance, and as I'm going to discuss, there are some points where he's admitted his ignorance, which I'm really thankful for him doing, and I really appreciate that. So I don't think he's doing any of these mistakes in bad faith. I think this is just a bit of ignorance, and you know, that's you can't fault ignorance. But yeah, so with that said, so Gavin's going to engage in 3 points that he wants to talk about with universalism. He says that number one, universalism has a tenuous relationship to Christian orthodoxy in the early church. Number two, it is more speculative than textual, meaning that in his mind, universalism is a philosophical position, not one arrived biblically. And then third, his statement that universalism is not just a claim about the end of things, but also all of reality. And I'll get more to that once we come around. So before we start engaging with each of the 3 points, I want to kind of discuss his own preliminary info. So he says that universalism is growing more popular first. And I really agree with this. He cites Pope Francis and then the evangelical Rob Bell, who caused a lot of ruckus. And I think his book Love Wins, released in like 2011. I mean, I would add to this people like Father Sergei Bulgakov, David Bentley Hart, Jordan Daniel Wood, Brad Jersak, Father Aidan Kimmel, Father John Baer, Robin Perry, Thomas Talbot, Eric Wrighton, myself, many others. And then for hopeful universalists, you have, I mean, notably you have St. Silouan the Athonite, and then you have Hans Urs von Balthasar. And I would actually put Pope Francis as more of a hopeful universalist. I'm not sure if he would consider himself a universalist, but anyway. So next thing he wants to do before he gets into, you know, justifying those three propositions, or those three positions, is he gives sort of, he kind of shows his cards, we'll say. He says, hey, you know, I'm going to be using this book a lot for much of my information, and the book in question is Michael McClymon's book, The Devil's Redemption, which he refers to as quote-unquote amazing. So if you're not familiar with this book, McClymon's is a Calvinist theologian, and he wrote this 2-volume, very, very long book on the history of universalism. And so he's writing it from an anti-universalist position. So what first I want to say is that throughout the video, not once does he cite Ilaria Ramelli and her book, The Christian Doctrine of Apokatastasis, released in 2013 by Brill. And he, later after the video was posted, he made a comment noting he didn't realize how important Ramelli was as a scholar on the history of universalism. And so he has since then bought her book, and I appreciate him for saying he, one, didn't know, and two, he's making an attempt to remedy his ignorance. I appreciate that, I really do. But I'm going to deal with the video as it is. In that comment, he also didn't say anything about McClymon's, but I'm going to say something about McClymon's. So, in the introduction of Grace Abounds, I compare Ramelli and McClymon's books because, you know, they're both histories of universalism, but I say that Ramelli's text is just simply better than the McClymon's. So I give, I guess 5 reasons, or I give 4. So number one, McClymon's book is worse off due to its limited source gathering, right? It doesn't gather as many sources from as many areas of Christianity throughout the history. Two, the text lacks a consistent methodology to evaluate the credibility of claims associated with the eschatology a person may or may not hold. So with Ramilli, her text is, while not meticulously, and well, not meticulous per se in its methodology, it does more clearly say, like, this is sort of the standard of evidence that would take for someone to be considered a universalist in church history. McClymonds offers no such thing. So I think that the third point is where we're going to see the issues throughout this video come in, and it's that McClymonds argues that universalism developed out of Gnostic predilections. So the problem today, and I would maybe nuance this more now, but what I say is that Gnosticism does not today, nor has really ever, been a coherent group been a coherent category that refers to a grounded, uniform set of beliefs held by a person and or a group. So, number one, Gnosticism is not really like a term we use anymore. Now, I'm going to discuss a little bit, believe me. We'll get to that. And the definition that McClymonds uses, moreover, is totally biblical in the sense that McClymonds does this thing, and I'll discuss more about Gnosticism. It'll be a kind of continuous theme throughout the video, but he defines Gnosticism in this he defines Gnosticism as a dualism between flesh and spirit. So the idea of the material world is bad and it's material, and then the heavenly realms are good because they're not material. So the problem with this is that that's Pauline. That's the most biblical you can get. That's the most Pauline you can get. That's what Paul believes, right? When Paul talks about the difference between pneuma, the goodness of pneuma, and the badness of sarx or flesh, Paul's not doing this sort of metaphorical thing that a lot of the early Protestants wanted to read. He doesn't say that, Paul sometimes uses flesh and spirit as also good and bad, and he also talks about sometimes of being not in the flesh while still in the physical flesh. Like it's a very interesting way of reading it in Greek, but Paul himself is a Stoic, he's a Platonist, he's a Greco-Roman living in the 1st century and a Jew. So he does think that spirit, pneuma, is good, and that flesh, our fleshy state, is bad. And if that's what Gnosticism is, which is what McClymonds claims Gnosticism is, then Paul is a Gnostic, which the Gnostics actually would say, and Tertullian says that the Gnostics loved Paul. So, but I don't think Paul's a Gnostic if you use a good definition of Gnosticism, which I will discuss later. The point is that if this is your thesis, that Gnosticism is based on a dualistic distinction, then Paul's a Gnostic, and Gnosticism is therefore biblical. So, there's many other problems with McClymonds' book. Number one, just in terms of the overall reading of it, it's a very unscholarly reading book. It's very polemical. It's not written as a scholarly text, unlike Ramilli's. And when you read the book reviews, people are like, yeah, there's many punctuation errors. There's dates getting wrong. There's many dates that are wrong. There's books that the titles are incorrect, and all this really terribly, the presentation of the content is not good, is basically what I'm saying. So because Ortlund claims that is his major source, and we'll see he cites it a lot, and he says it is quote unquote amazing, that already cast a very bad look throughout on the video itself. But we'll continue. So getting into the first tenet, Universalism's tenuous relationship to orthodoxy. So his first claim is that Origen is the greatest influence on universalism in the ancient church. I have no problem admitting this. I think that it's uncontroversial that Origen is the greatest influence on universalism, though he is not the progenitor of universalism. And the various texts written before Origen teach universalism. Origen's teacher, St. Clement, taught universalism. The texts I'm talking about, if you would like to read them, are the Apocalypse of Peter and then the Shepherd of Hermes. Those texts both have a universalist bend. So the next thing, we're back to his claim. He repeats this after talking about McClymonds. He then talks about how universalism emerged from Gnostic teachers in Alexandria. So again, McClymonds' definition is totally anachronistic. And to just a little bit discuss about Gnosticism now. So I'm currently writing a book where my grasp of ancient Gnosticism is extremely important. And so I've read through the historiographical debate throughout the 20th century up to today. And I can tell you that defining Gnosticism as a dualistic distinction between flesh and spirit has not been taken seriously since about the 1950s. That is to say, Ortlund and McClymans and Ortlund concurs. Their definition is a position not held by scholars of Gnosticism since about World War II, right? So if you do want to give a definition of Gnosticism, and I do this, and I think that it is, we're going to get off topic. I'll just say that I don't think we should stop using the term Gnosticism in scholarship. I think it does have a coherent categorization of a cluster of theological beliefs, but we're not here to discuss that. So I'll just say that a far more serious definition of Gnosticism focuses on the role of an evil and ignorant demiurge or divine craftsman who created the universe. The problem is that Origen didn't believe that, and it's something that later Universalists also did not believe. Thus, Universalism does not have a Gnostic beginning. So, the next point that he talks about is these various controversies in the early church, known as the First and Second Origenist controversy. Unfortunately, he doesn't discuss the first controversy, but I'll just say that it sort of developed as in Alexandrian monasteries, and then in various monasteries sort of around the Mediterranean, and then up to Palestine. There were various debates about Origenist doctrine, and then you had famous people like Saint Jerome the Great and Saint Theophilus of Alexandria do these writings against certain Origenists at the time, like Evagrius Ponticus and Didymus the Blind, Saint Didymus the Blind. But he talks about the second Origenist controversy, and this is one that a lot of people have heard of. If you know anything about Origenism, you probably know about Constantinople II, the Fifth Ecumenical Council in 553, and what occurred. The problem is here that Ortlund kind of, I'm trying to be charitable, but this is a very haphazard wading into the scholarship on Origen's reception at Constantinople II. So the better half of Chapter 10 in Grace Abounds is devoted to the subject, so I'm just going to kind of summarize my scholarship and the other scholarship from, leading scholars in the field on this. So first, the odd thing is that he cites Father Richard Price, who is the leading scholar on the Ecumenical Councils, and I've communicated with him over email regarding the content of my chapter. But Ortlund doesn't actually cite Price's conclusions. He cites Price just to say, like, I think it's something. It's a very general statement about Constantinople II, but he doesn't actually agree with any Price's conclusions nor cite them. And so the viewer reads the scholar talking about something, and without Ortlund further stating his disagreements with the scholar, if he is aware of Father Richard Price's scholarship on this, it leaves the viewer thinking that scholar agrees with Ortlund. So that's a bit disingenuous, not purposefully, but it comes off disingenuous. Obviously, that's not intended. So Price, as any serious commentator on 553, traces the anti-Origenist sentiment to a series of protracted political debates originating in Palestinian monastic communities around the year 512, when a Syrian Origenist named Stephen Bar Sundial comes basically and settles in one of the monasteries. Now, interestingly, I think Ortlund knows this stuff because he mentions, we're going to see this later, he mentions Sundial in his third section. So not discussing Sundial in the context of 553 is very odd. But anyways, through the 540s, after Emperor Justinian released a series of anathemas condemning Origenism, a distinction emerged in these Palestinian monastic communities between Origenists who affirmed a number of heretical, Christological, pneumatical, and other positions, and then Origenists who became allied with the Palestinian ecclesial orthodoxy. Long story short, in the years leading up to 553, the Patriarch of Jerusalem wrote to Justinian asking for a council to be called in which Origen would be condemned. Justinian did precisely that and condemned Origen in Canon 11 of the council. But, this is important, Justinian did not specify why Origen was condemned. Now, some scholars, like Ilario Romelli, who I mentioned earlier, who has that very good book on the history of Universalism, think that Origen's name is an interpolation. That is to say that the original text of the Acts of Constantinople II don't include Origen's name in Canon 11. Now, I kind of engage with her argument a little bit, and while I find it she points out some odd observations about the Canon 11, but I still disagree. I think Origen was condemned by name, but the important point is that there is no stated reason as to why he was condemned. Now, this is when you turn your historian hat on. You go, okay, well, what am I supposed to do? You know, there's no reason why he was condemned, so let's put our historian hats on. As a historian, what you do is you look at the surrounding environment in which any event occurs. Doing this shows that Origen's theology itself was not condemned, but rather that of a particular group of Palestinian Origenists. Those were known as the Isochrist, if you wanted to look more into this. Many of these people believed in things that strongly differ from Origen himself. To just kind of summarize this, in the words of Elizabeth Clark, who wrote a stellar monograph that I highly recommend on the Origenist crisis, quote, "At times, the charge of Origenism was so malleable that Origen's theology was often obscured in the clamor of contemporary debate. That is to say, when Origen was condemned, Origen himself wasn't being condemned. Origen was a stand-in for the Palestinian Origenist that Justinian and the Patriarch Mina of Constantinople at the time were having issues with." It's pretty basic. It's pretty basic once you put your historian hat on, but you have to dig a little bit, right? You have to look at the spirit of the text, as St. Paul would say, and not the letter itself, for the letter kills. Ortlund then goes on to cite McClymans, who says that we should look at the reception history of the council, because Ortlund says, hey, he kind of says, okay, there's some debates about what exactly happened at Constantinople too. He doesn't really get into those debates, but he says that there's some debates. So he says, McClymans is right to say that we should look at the reception history of the council to see what was condemned. And according to McClymans, the reception history says that Universalism was condemned. The problem here is that McClymans and implicitly Ortlund seem to be muddying the witness of Cyril of I hate pronouncing this guy's name. I had to read it out in front of a crowd. Scythopolis. We'll just say Scythopolis. There's this weird CY, Cyril of Scythopolis, who 5 years after Constantinople III wrote in 553 that the 15 anathemas written in the same year stemmed from Constantinople II itself. Sorry, I said Constantinople III. Constantinople II itself. So there are some major issues with the reliability of this witness. Father Richard Price in private told me that his statements are too general to suggest this direct knowledge of the documents. And in a text, Samuel Rubinson has said that any use of Cyril requires a, quote, prudent call for caution. This, but more importantly, besides this, the unreliability of this witness is that Ortlund and, McClymans and implicitly Ortlund are just engaging in a mix-up, really. Cyril did not say that Origen's Universalism was condemned. McClymans read that out of Cyril's claim about the 15 anathemas. So that is to say, the person that they seem to be pointing to as who we should trust for reception history, because he is our, I can grant, earliest witness of the council and the proceedings thereof, did not say that Origen's Universalism was condemned. He simply says that the anathemas are from the council, and from that statement, McClymans reads wrongly that Origen's Universalism was condemned. The reason why this is wrong is because the 15 anathemas don't condemn universalism. Whole cloth, I should say. The one anathema which may indicate a condemnation of universalism is anathema 12. However, I spend 3 pages in chapter 10 of Grace Abounds explaining why it does not. Father Richard Price, once again, sums up my view when he said in private that it, quote, doesn't constitute a condemnation of saner and more sober varieties of universalism, unquote. Turning to the later ecumenical councils, since that is surely where Ortlund would want to look as a reception history, there is not a single reference to the notion that universalism was condemned at Constantinople II. The possible condemnation of universalism in definition 7 of Nicaea II is I extensively refute in chapter 10, and even that isn't at all mentioned in connection to Constantinople II. You have to understand the context of this stuff, and I don't have time to do that. So I'm just telling you, you got to read chapter 10. I explain all of this. So the question should be to Ortlund, what reception, well, to McClymonds and Ortlund, what reception history should we look at? Should we look at even later church fathers than Nicaea II? Okay, I don't really care if an 11th century figure says that a council 600 years ago condemned something, yet we have no evidence to think it was condemned, right? Historians trust later witnesses if those later witnesses have relevant documents that we today do not have. To our knowledge, no witness, no church father writing in the 10th, 11th century has certain documents that are very damning to the claim that Origen's Universalism was not condemned that we don't have, right? So that's the point. Historians, we don't look to those things unless we have reason to think so. So in the end, I have to say that, you know, I get the vibe that Ortlund and McClymonds are both merely expressing their discontent that historians since the 19th century are uprooting their preconceptions about Constantinople too, which were hardened to a lot of later Christians after at least past Nicaea II onwards. Fittingly, I say that this tracks with their discontent at biblical scholars who question their assumptions regarding the historicity of the Old Testament and even parts of the New Testament. You know, maybe the issue is more of a discontent towards historical methodology and not the historians themselves, and not the findings of the historians themselves that are rooted in the methodology. That is to say that I think this is more of an axiomatic dispute than a dispute about the findings themselves. Ortlund and McClymonds don't like the don't like the axioms that historians today use. Therefore, you know, they are more mad at the use of those axioms, the axioms that structure current historiography, than the findings themselves. Okay, we had to cover a lot there, and you know, I apologize. You know, not everyone knows what definition 7 is off the top of their head. Not everyone knows 15.5 off the top of their head. This is a long video. I can't explain all of this stuff. You have to have background knowledge, and again, I point you to my book where it is. So the next claim that Ortlund makes is that there are not many Universalists after Constantinople II. So I would say that while true that the numbers decreased by this point, the numbers really began decreasing around like 450 or like 430. He points to Saint Isaac the Syrian, who was a Universalist, but he does not mention other Universalists after Constantinople II, like Saint John Dalyatha, who was a fellow monk of Isaac. This also does not mention the extremely profound influence of John Scotus Erigena, who was an Irish mystic Catholic in the, I believe, 10th century. Nor, this is extremely important, the continued presence of Universalism in Eastern Syrian monastic communities and among the clergy well into the 14th century. We know that a clergyman from the Church of the East in the 14th century explicitly believed in Universalism and taught it at the public level. So, you know, maybe it fell away from the West, which I talk about, and I do think that Universalism fell out of the West far earlier than the East, but the East never really gave it up, and I would say that it continued in many areas of the East up to today. So the next thing that he talks about are, you know, he's not going in order of church history. You know, we hit Constantinople II, we're talking about afterwards. Now Ortlund's going back before Constantinople II into the very, very early church. So he says that he points to a couple of early church Universalists. He points to Origen, Saint Didymus the Blind, Theodore Malpuesta, Saint Gregory of Nyssa, and then he says that Saint Maximus the Confessor and Saint Gregory of Nazianzus are more ambivalent. So all of this is true. I agree that Saint Maximus is more ambivalent, and I think that Saint Gregory of Nazianzus is also more ambivalent, which is why I don't rate them certainly as Universalists on my introduction. I rate them very likely Universalists on my introduction. Now, I don't fault him for not listing all the other Universalists in the period, but, you know, in my introduction, I lay out about 25 other saints that the church has said these people are saints. They're holy, right? So, you know, we have 25 saints. that are, I would say, more like 20 saints are certainly Universalist, and then another like 7 or so are like very likely Universalist. And the distinction of those is that we don't have any explicit statement about universalism, but we have strong universalist leanings. We have a strong association with Origen's theology generally, and other things that point us to that conclusion, which I describe my methodology in more detail in the introduction of Grace Abounds. So again, I point you to that. So very few people who may be watching this video have read all of these 20 figures. Very few people are aware of Saint Eustochium Julia, who died in 419, right? But more people are aware of Saint Cyril of Alexandria, right? So, many of these people are saints. Many of these people are holy figures of the church. And in the case of the Cappadocians, Saint Gregory of Nyssa, Saint Gregory Nazianzus, Saint Basil the Great, these figures have an even stronger weight to their theology because of their influence on orthodoxy. And if you want to get into then the reliance of this for Catholics, the Sixth Ecumenical Council says that these certain figures have sort of have a normative influence on theology, and they name many of the Cappadocians. Actually, they name all the Cappadocians, and they also name a lot of Universalists. Oddly enough, they name Saint Dionysius, they name Saint Didymus. Of course, they name Augustine, who was not a Universalist. Later in life, he was in his earlier life. But so, the point is that there are far more Universalist figures in the church, and the point is that there are clearly a lot of Universalist figures in the church, and in addition, if statements made by Augustine of Hippo and Basil are correct, there were tens of thousands of Universalists in the 3rd and 4th century across the East and West. So, we have these saints, and then we have these claims from Augustine and Basil that there were lots of Universalists roaming about. Basil uses the term hoi polloi, which can sort of mean, it's debated, but polloi usually means like many. So hoi would be like the many, right? So the majority, the many, however you want to read it, it's clear there were a lot of Universalists, according to Basil, who was very well traveled, so he would be someone to trust, and Augustine, who says this as well in a different way. So moving from that, Ortlund then starts discussing how Origen, I'll give him a quote. Ortlund quote says, Origen was always a controversial figure, always. He doubles down always. And then he cites this monk named Shinuete of Atripe, who was a Coptic monk, who says that Origen teaches mysteries of the devil. So, my response, Origen has always had his naysayers, but the fact that he was so well received by the Cappadocians and the father of Egyptian monasticism, St. Anthony the Great, whom Shinut studied under, makes the statement sound very polemic and unjustified. I don't, and even if Shinut, did believe this, he's clearly being, he's clearly not being consistent, because he doesn't believe that the father of Egyptian monasticism, St. Anthony, is, teaching mysteries of the devil, believing mysteries of the devil, right? So even if he does, this is just another person who is not a Universalist talking bad about Universalism, which no Universalist has an issue with recognizing that there were anti-Universalists in the early church, just as there were anti-Trinitarians for a very long time. So this next Ortlund cites Richard Bacham, who says that, quote, almost all Christian theologians taught the eternality of hell. So Bacham is a stellar scholar of early Christianity and someone who actually has the chops to back up the claims he makes about the early church, unlike McClymonds. The problem with this statement is that it's from an article from 1978. Today, Bacham thinks that there was a great number of supporters of Universalism in the early church. Want to know how I know this? He accepted Ilaria Ramelli's request for him to write the foreword to her book, A Larger Hope, which largely summarizes for a lay audience many of the arguments put forth in her big monograph, The Christian Doctrine of Apokatastasis. Whether Bacham always believed this was true way back in 1978, and he just said this, as a sort of catch-all term, almost all, I don't know. What I do know is that A video in 2025 citing a scholar who wrote more than 40 years ago about universalism without mentioning or looking at why his views shifted more than, by this point, 10 years ago. It's another case of Ortlund's unintentional ignorance. I don't think it's purposeful. I think it's irresponsible. So, with discussing the early church out of the way, now let's hit on his second point. Universalism is speculative. His second thesis is that universalism is philosophical in character and its motivations rather than being biblical in its character and motivations. So his first statement is that universalists justify their view based on an esoteric reading of Scripture rather than a literal view. Yeah, we do. When doing theology, I proudly hold to a view that approaches Scripture in a Christ-centered way that reads everything in and through the Incarnation. Now, of course, when I'm doing historical biblical scholarship, I won't do that, but when I'm doing theology, I'm accepting the presuppositions associated with a spiritual reading of the Scriptures. But Ortlund, you too believe there are esoteric meanings in Scripture. You read Jesus as the angel of the Lord following the interpretive practice of Jude and Paul. But this is obviously not in the actual text of the Old Testament. So you too read esoteric meanings into Scriptures. Christians have always done this. St. Paul did this himself. When St. Paul engages with the traditions of Eden and Adam, he's not reading Genesis. He's working off the later traditions developed in the books of Sirach and the books of Wisdom of Solomon. He's not using Genesis. He's using these later traditions, and he's seeing that as an esoteric reading of the statements in Genesis, right? If St. Paul believed that Genesis was totally cool on its own and didn't, cool. But he clearly didn't, because he uses the interpretive lens of the writers of Wisdom of Solomon and the Book of Sirach. In other words, everyone reads Scripture esoterically. So I think that point is it's a very null point. The second point is that Universalist exegesis is meant to be understood by a select few, not the whole. So, you can see what he's doing here. He's trying to get back to this notion of Universalism's alleged Gnostic origins, right? Putting the emphasis on how Universalists believe in the importance of a small elite group knowing the right method of reading Scripture while everyone else stumbles around lost. The problem is that, as David Litwell has shown so well, every early Christian, Gnostic and otherwise, believed in secret teachings that only a few select can understand. Like many, particularly Western Christians today, Ortlund doesn't want to come to terms with this. He desires the idea that there are mysteries only certain groups of people can understand. He desires this to be Gnostic because he doesn't like recognizing this, because it makes Christianity sound quite close to its pagan progenitors. Because when a religion forms, it obviously takes things that are in its selective environment. And this is one of those things. Christianity was highly influenced by mystery cults. Obviously not to the extent that some early 20th century scholars believed, but it definitely was. For instance, what else does Mark 4 mean when Jesus says that he speaks in secrets to the disciples? Is Mark a Gnostic text? That is the clear reading of it, and the entire motif of the messianic secret throughout Mark's gospel gets to this notion of only a special group having secret knowledge. In a very biblical way then, mirroring that of Christ himself, I and many other Universalists throughout history, including Origen, have tended to keep Universalism as a view not blurted out in the streets for a number of pastoral reasons, right? If this view to Ortlund is Gnostic, then Jesus is Gnostic, because Jesus has a messianic secret, and he speaks in mysteries to his disciples. Also, there's a statement in Matthew, I believe, about how Jesus speaks in parables to others, to them, autois, but he speaks the mysteries. This might also be in Mark, but he speaks the mysteries to the disciples. So, in that sense, we might say that Universalism is the present age's messianic secret. It will eventually be revealed to all people, but it doesn't seem to be revealed yet. And that's okay, because Christ himself showed that mysteries are good to keep. Of course, digging a little bit more into this idea of, the silly idea really, that mysteries, that believing that mysteries should be kept for select groups is not traditional. I mean, we have this entire idea in the Orthodox Church before you partake in the Eucharist that you say, I will not reveal the mysteries, I will not reveal your mysteries to your enemies, or I will not reveal the mysteries to your enemies, or give you a kiss as did Judas, but like the thief, I say to you, Lord, remember me in your kingdom. This is what Orthodox Christians say every Sunday before partaking in the Eucharist, right? So we say this, we say mysteries. We say we will not reveal the mysteries to your enemies. If this was in a text like the Testimony of Truth or the Apocryphon of John, or this would be read as Gnostic. But the fact is that every religion has secrets. Every religion has different hierarchies of knowledge, where when you progress, you grow in that knowledge, and, you know, that's totally normal. For instance, I'll push on this one more. We don't talk to like little kids about the ins and outs of like theosis. You know, little kids learn about Noah's Ark, Jesus feeding the children, you know, things like that. They don't need to know the ins and outs of theosis. They're not ready yet, right? Similarly, Universalism may well be the present age's messianic secret. So, Ortlund's next point that I also think is, you know, I'm trying to engage with his claims charitably, so not to just poke at the statements that he makes, and to try and get into what he's saying, like the logic of it. But I do have to poke at this statement because I think that the logic, the logic I think is bad is what he is saying in this very general statement. So his statement is that, quote, biblically it is very hard to make a case for universalism, unquote. So I agree, actually, right? Yeah, universalism is hard to make a case for biblically, because it is hard to make a case biblically for any one eschatological position, because the writers of every book of the Bible, including Paul, who seems to have evolved in his eschatological views, have a different take on eschatology, right? Every book of the Bible has a different take on eschatology, and sometimes it's not even consistent in the books themselves, you know. So in chapter 5, I make a very persuasive case that Paul held universalism for most of his life. I then address Romans 9 through 11 in chapter 9, and I also make the case that the book of Revelation teaches universalism at the end of the text, and so on. The issue is not in regard to finding a single eschatology that coheres with all the biblical data, because that is impossible due to the tensions and contradictions that abound, especially in the Old Testament, which didn't even really have the notion of an afterlife. Once Israel, well, it kind of did have, well, it's actually, this is going to be too much, but let's just say that in Israel's pre-monotheistic period, there was an idea of the afterlife. And we do see hints of this in sort of in the story known as the Witch of Endor, right? And we have found our archaeologists have found burial tombs that resemble that of ancient Egyptians, where there are tombs with rooms inside so the dead can walk around in them and things, right? This was in Israel's pre-monotheistic period. Once Israel became monotheistic and Second Temple Judaism began as we know it, whenever that happened, yeah, it's a huge debate, then sort of completely shut off any notion of an afterlife. Then, once Hellenism came along and began to seep into Judaism by the 3rd century BC, then you have this notion of an afterlife come back again. So my point is that it's impossible to find a single eschatology that coheres with every book of the Bible. The goal should be finding a Christ-centered eschatology, and I think that the only one that fits that is Universalism. His next quote is that the Universalist passages are much easier to reconcile to particularism than particularist passages are to reconcile to Universalism. I disagree. I think discussing this would take too much time too much time here. I'm already at 40 minutes. I've discussed it before on my channel. So I recommend watching those videos and reading chapter 5 and chapter 9 of Grace Abounds, where I discuss all of these passages that he wants to talk about, where a notion of all or pantes doesn't, in his mind, doesn't actually mean all. Or when Paul says that every being on the earth, under the earth, and above the earth will confess that Kyrios Iesus Christos, that Lord Jesus Christ, they will confess that Jesus is Lord, and thus give Jesus his due epistemic authority. What does that mean? Well, I discussed that in other places, and so I'm not going to take your time by discussing that here. But I will just say that I think that both sides, Universalism and Particularism, have a difficult time reconciling different passages. But of course, for myself, and I think many Universalists today that are more scholarly in their attitudes, they don't have a problem with having non-reconciled passages. Not everything has to cohere together. Okay, so that's the end of his section on Universalism is speculative. Let's go to his last section, Universalism and Ontology. So this section argues that early Universalists tended to have an ontologically monistic view of reality. That is to say, the belief that all things are primordially connected. Universalism, then, or universal salvation, that event itself, is supposed to restore this cosmic unity. So, I'll give an example. Let's say that I smash a glass on the floor. Universalism would say that the event, that at one point that glass will materialize back into its status as a vase, that being its primordial unity. Okay, so that's what Universalism teaches in Origen's mind. Once again, I wholeheartedly agree that this is an ontological tendency of Universalism. But, contra Ortlund, I consider this one of the most beautiful fruits of the doctrine. That being that Universalism isn't just... Actually, I'll say this. Universalism is a cosmic belief, both literally and figuratively. Cosmically, all will be restored. Figuratively, universal salvation has an impact on every theological doctrine you hold in some sort of way. So, I agree, basically. Ortlund gives an example of someone who says this, who he thinks points to this idea of a primordial unity and how Universalism is going to restore that. And that person is the one and only Stephen Bar Sundial, who, if you remember, we encountered him as that Syrian Origenist towards the start, who, kind of started the Origenist crisis, which led to Constantinople II in part, right? So that Origen cites him shows that he knows his context. And I think not mentioning that is, again, I don't think this is on purpose, but I do think that it leaves the reader not understanding the actual historical situation of Constantinople II. I'll say that. So what does Sundial say? Well, he says, quote, "All things are destined to be commingled in the Father. All is commingled and the Word is fulfilled, which said, quote, God shall be all in all," which is the Word. Yes, it comes from St. Paul, 1 Corinthians chapter 15:28. My favorite verse in the entire Bible, right? O Theos estai pantes en pasin. God will be all in all. It's a wonderful verse. And like many, Sundial says, yeah, all in all, okay. All things will be commingled in the Father. If you read before the verse 26 and 27 describe the process of Jesus handing over himself and the kingdom to the Father. So then the clear logical intention is that, okay, well, after that happens, if God is all in all, Jesus hand himself over to the Father, then all things shall be commingled in the Father as well. This is a very, very conservative, literalistic, biblical exegesis you're encountering here. But Ortlund doesn't like that, because literalism only works for him when it can be used to push doctrines that are ahistorical rather than more interesting and speculative theological doctrines, which seem to be in the literalist understanding of the text. But I'll put that aside. That was a little bit too polemic. I apologize, Ortlund. You know what I'm getting at. But the difference between Sundial and a Universalist more in the vein of Origen himself, or Father Sergei Bulgakov, or myself, or Father John Baer, or Jordan Daniel Wood, and so on, is that Sundial truly seems to believe that the universe will be consubstantial with God. This is a heretical belief. Universalists today don't believe that. Origen didn't believe that. St. Gregory of Nyssa didn't believe that. St. Maximus didn't believe that. St. Didymus didn't believe it. St. Isaac the Syrian didn't believe that, and so on and so forth. Right? God will always be above creation divinity, since creation is only made divine through its participation in God. Right? But this does not mean that all of creation will not be made divine. All creation will be made divine, but no part of creation will have the status of God. A really cool way to think about this for someone with a high Mariology like myself is we say that all of creation in the eschaton will have the status of Mary that Mary has today. As Father Bulgakov puts it in his book on Sophiology, Mary stands at the middle point between creation and the Trinity. She's above creation, but she's not at the Trinity, right? She can't be at the Trinity. So if all have the status of Mary, then all are still lower than the Trinity. But even if one does not have a high Mariology, you can still hold the position that all beings will forever remain ontologically lower than God, while still believing that all beings will be made divine and enjoy the beauty and the life of heaven. So, Ortlund then goes on to cite David Breakey for his argument that this idea of returning to a pre-creative unity is Gnostic. We're back to Gnosticism. And once again, I am 40 pages into an ongoing project where I discuss Gnosticism. And I engage with Breakey. So this is another case of ignorance on Ortlund's part, but the immediate problem with citing Breakey, as someone speaking for the wider Gnostic view, is that Breakey only considers the text known as the Apocryphon of John, found in the 4 manuscripts of the Nag Hammadi library, during his analysis of Gnosticism. That is to say, Breakey doesn't look at any, really, he mentions a couple here and there, but the only text that Breakey's focused on in his study of Gnosticism and the 2012 book that he cites and I've read is the Apocryphon of John. He's not engaging with Testimony of Truth. He's not engaging with Second Treatise of the Great Seth. He's not engaging with Exegesis on the Soul, Gospel of Philip, and so on and so forth, right? He's engaging with one text, and I agree that this notion does correspond well to the narrative of the Apocryphon of John, but it doesn't correspond well for many other Gnostic texts. Therefore, if Ortlund's argument is that because this notion of pre-creative unity is Gnostic, therefore Universalism is Gnostic, the problem is that this isn't Gnostic. And in any case, if this idea was in fact Gnostic, just for the sake of argument, but was appropriated by church fathers like St. Gregory of Nyssa, then this is just yet another example of Orthodox saints baptizing non-Orthodox philosophy by taking the fruits of a non-Orthodox Christian concept and leaving the rest. I see nothing wrong with this. This is what Christians continually do over and over throughout history. We look at a culture that the religion develops in, and we take the good things from that culture and we leave the rest. Synchronism. This isn't... Syncretism isn't even a word used in religious scholarship today because it is a priori obvious. There is no non-syncretist religion. Every religion is associating with those religions that are around it and that it forms itself out of. This is totally cool, So, the last substantive point in this video that Ortlund makes is that if one does not accept the notion of primordial unity, then one does not have a reason to accept eschatological unity. That is to say, if you don't believe that all things were in some sense primordially united, however you want to understand this, you don't have a reason to accept eschatological unity, because what is propelling that eschatological unity? But this flounders in several ways. Again, I accept primordial unity. I think it's a patristic view. It's a Platonic view. I think it just makes philosophical sense. But supposing one does not, they certainly have reasons for holding to universalism. At the end of chapter 11 of Grace Abounds, I expand upon John Cronin and Eric Wrighton's philosophical argument that it is mathematically guaranteed universal salvation will be obtained, even with the belief in libertarian free will. Libertarian free will. Okay. Libertarian free will is the belief that free will is the ability to choose an option from an array of alternatives. This does not involve any sort of a natural will drawing us towards God. And yet, under libertarian free will, universal salvation is still mathematically guaranteed. You know? So, that's the point, is that if you don't want to hold to a primordial understanding of free will and all this, you should. It's the patristic view. It's the Platonic view. It makes sense. But if you don't want to hold to that, you don't have to. You can hold libertarian free will and believe in universalism. So, all right, that's the last point I want to make on this video. Overall, in Ortlund's video, I think he makes a few surprising points that I seriously didn't expect in this video. Ortlund makes videos for a very public lay audience, mostly comprised of probably low church Baptist, right? So a video where he discusses church history and he brings up things like, Constantinople too, like many viewers of his channel probably haven't even heard of that. So I seriously didn't expect some things, but the things I didn't expect were more because I was like, oh, wait, why did he bring that up, Nothing he says should cause a universalist even the slightest worry. And responding and addressing my infernalist audience members, because I know there are some of you, some of my friends in the audience as well. For you guys, his arguments are all really poor, and so if you're using Ortlund's, sort of as a guide to arguments against universalism, I would advise against doing that, and I would look to other sources as a guide to universalism, as a guide to responding to universalism. So, with that said, this is probably the longest video on my channel that's not an interview, but I found it to be a very worthwhile video to make, and I hope that the more organized nature of this video is appealing, and go ahead and like, subscribe, comment what you think, and share. I hope Ortlund sees this. I would love for him to see this video. I try to remain charitable throughout. I did have a couple of polemic takes, thrown in. He has some of those in his own video, though, so, tit for tat, right? But yeah, thank you, and have a nice day.